On a Tuesday evening in late March, I watched a young woman get turned away from the restaurant across the street, and I made a decision that changed everything that came after. The place, Galloway's, all reclaimed wood and Edison bulbs and $12 cocktails with herbs nobody's ever heard of, had been open about 8 months, long enough to know exactly what kind of clientele it was courting. The woman was maybe 35, well-dressed by any reasonable standard, carrying a canvas tote and a folder of papers, and she'd pushed through that door looking like someone who'd made a plan. They turned her around in under 2 minutes. I could see the whole thing through my front window, from behind the register at Briggs Hardware. She came out and stopped on the sidewalk, and the rain that had been threatening all day finally decided to make good on it. Not slowly, it just opened up. She stood there with the folder held over her head, which was doing precisely nothing, and I could see on her face the particular expression of someone who is very tired and has reached the end of whatever patience they came in with. I pulled on my jacket and grabbed the umbrella from the stand by the door. Navy blue, wooden handle. Irene had picked it out the Christmas before she got sick, and I went out to her. She wasn't on the ground. She was just standing there, getting soaked, which in some ways is harder to approach than someone who's fallen. You can offer a hand to someone who's fallen. Walking up to a stranger in the rain requires you to say something. "That place isn't worth your time," I said. "Neither is hypothermia." She looked at me, brown eyes, very direct, the kind of person who decides about you in the first 2 seconds and doesn't revise much after. "I'm all right," she said. "You're standing in a puddle in March," I said. "You're not all right. Come on. Hector runs the diner 2 doors down, and he keeps the coffee hot until 9. I don't know why I thought she'd come with me. She didn't look like someone who needed rescuing, and I didn't think of it that way. I just thought she looked cold, and I had been cold and turned away from things myself, at various points in my 67 years, and I remembered what it felt like to have someone treat that as a problem worth solving. She came with me. Her name was Cora. She told me when we got inside, and Hector set 2 mugs down without being asked, which was typical of Hector. She said it, the way some people give their names, like it's complete information and not an invitation for follow-up. We talked, or I talked, and she listened in the careful way of someone who is very good at it, which I recognized because Irene had been the same way. I told her about the shop, about the 22 years I'd had it, about Irene. I don't know why I told her all of that. I hadn't had coffee with a stranger in a long time. She told me she was in town for work. She didn't say more than that, and I didn't press. When we finished and the rain had dropped to something manageable, I gave her the umbrella. She argued the way you argue when you've been told no enough times in your life that accepting things without pushback starts to feel dangerous. "Take it," I said. "My car's in the lot around back. I'll get there before you would." She took it, then I reached into my jacket pocket. I'd been carrying Irene's old customer notebook since I found it in the junk drawer 2 weeks earlier, meaning to bring it to the shop. Small, spiral-bound, the kind she'd kept at the register for years. Customer names, phone numbers, notes about orders, who needed what around the holidays. Her handwriting filling maybe 2/3 of it. I'd been carrying it because I couldn't decide where it belonged, which was the kind of thinking I did about Irene's things that got me nowhere, and that I did anyway. "My number's inside," I said, opening to the first page where Irene had written Wallace, Briggs Hardware, Clement Ave in her careful printed hand, the way she wrote everything she wanted to last. "If you need anything while you're in town, or if you want to bring the umbrella back sometime, you know where to find me." Cora took the notebook with both hands, carefully, like she understood she was holding something that meant more than it looked. "Thank you," she said. I walked back to the shop in the rain and stood inside for a minute after I locked the door, listening to the quiet. Irene had loved the shop after hours. She said it smelled like sawdust and possibility, which was exactly the kind of thing she said. My phone buzzed on the counter, a text from my daughter Leah. "Dad, Sterling and I are going to swing by the shop tomorrow morning. There's something we need to go over with you. Make sure you're there." I read it twice. Then I put the phone in my pocket and looked at the row of pipe fittings. I'd been meaning to reorganize for a week, and I didn't reorganize them. I just stood there and thought about the kind of weather you can feel coming in your joints before you ever see the clouds. Percy Odom had been with me since I opened. He was 52 years old and had the methodical patience of someone who'd spent his whole working life fixing things other people had given up on. He arrived at 7:30 the next morning, same as always, stomping mud off his boots in the vestibule and hanging his jacket on the peg by the back door. I was already behind the counter, doing nothing useful. "You're here early," Percy said. "Couldn't sleep." He got his coffee and started in on the inventory, and we worked in the comfortable silence that takes years to build with another person. At some point, he set down what he was doing and turned to face me fully, which told me what was coming before he said a word. About 3 weeks ago, he said, while I was at my cardiologist's appointment, Sterling had come in through the back door, not the front, the back. He'd said I'd asked him to pick up something from the office, insurance documents, some kind of folder. Very smooth about it, very casual. Percy had told him he couldn't allow anyone into the office without me there. Sterling had offered him $500 cash. I told him to leave, Percy said. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was holding himself still on purpose. And I didn't tell you, because I kept thinking I'd misread the situation. He looked at me steadily. I didn't misread it. I thought about what was in that office cabinet. The property deed for the building. 8 months of correspondence with my attorney Morton Graves, ever since I'd started noticing certain things about the development notices going up on Clement Avenue. The kind of things you notice when you've owned a corner lot for 22 years and somebody suddenly starts paying attention to it. You did right, I said, both times. Percy nodded once, sharp, the exhale of a man who has been carrying something and has finally been given permission to set it down. At 8:47, the bell above the front door rang. Leah came in first. My daughter was 41 years old and had her mother's cheekbones and her own kind of tension, not Irene's kind, which had always been about caring too much about everything at once, but something more managed, more contained. She was wearing a gray coat I didn't recognize, and she wasn't looking at anything in the shop. Not the old brass register her mother had found at an estate sale and refused to part with. Not the step stool in the corner she'd sat on every Saturday morning as a little girl. She looked at me and said, "Dad, we need to talk." Sterling came in behind her, 44 years old, broad across the shoulders, silver at his temples, the kind of man who photographs well and tells you exactly what you want to hear in exactly the right order. He'd been my son-in-law for 16 years. In that time, I had never once seen him be wrong in a way he'd acknowledge. "Wallace," he said, with the warmth he used when he wanted something. "Good to see you." "Sterling," I said. 2 more people followed. A man in a suit with a briefcase, late 40s, the build of someone who exercises out of anxiety rather than enjoyment, introduced himself as Thatcher, a business consultant. A woman in a blazer with a clipboard pressed to her chest introduced herself as a property assessor. Neither of them looked at me the way you look at someone you respect. They looked at me the way you look at a variable. I stayed behind the counter. Sterling pulled a customer stool up to the counter and sat down with his elbows on the surface, leaning forward in the posture of a man having a sincere conversation. He had perfected this posture over 16 years. They were concerned about me, he said. Leah was concerned. There had been some things that worried them. There was an incident last fall with the propane torch. I had left it on, he said. I had not left it on. Percy had checked, I said so. There was also the deposit bag I'd misplaced in January. I set it in the wrong drawer, I said. I found it in 3 days. Dad, Leah's voice from near the window. She was still not looking at me directly, 2 spots of color high on her cheeks. We just want to help. Thatcher opened his briefcase and produced a document, thick paper, professional letterhead from a firm I didn't know. A trust instrument, he explained. It would place the management of the business and the building into the hands of a trustee, temporary, just while certain concerns were being evaluated. The trustee on the signature line was Sterling. In the state of Ohio, placing a competent adult's assets under a third-party trustee requires a court order. A probate judge has to sign off. The person in question has the right to legal counsel and the right to contest the proceeding with their own representation. A document produced by a consultant in a hardware store signed under these circumstances would be voidable for duress and potentially fraudulent on its face. My attorney Morton Graves had explained all of this to me 9 months ago. I had not been idle in those 9 months. I looked at the document for a moment, then I looked at my daughter. "Leah," I said. She looked at me. For just a second, 1 second, something shifted under the managed expression. The thing that was still her underneath everything that had grown over it. "Do you remember what you used to ask me about the store when you were little? Why we kept records of everything?" She said nothing. Her hands were still at her sides. "I told you it was because a store isn't just a store," I said. "It's everyone who's ever counted on it." Sterling leaned forward. "Wallace, I understand this feels confrontational. It isn't. This building is worth considerably more than you may realize. There are opportunities." "Sterling," Leah said his name. He stopped. I looked at my son-in-law across the counter, at the perfect calibration of his expression, the warmth that had never once failed him in a difficult room. "You came through my back door 3 weeks ago," I said, "while I was at the doctor." He went very still. You offered my employee $500 to let you into my office. The refrigerator hummed in the back room. Outside, a delivery truck moved slowly past on Clement Avenue. Nobody in the shop said anything. There's a deed in that cabinet, I said, and correspondence with my attorney about the Clement Avenue development proposals, the ones with the name of your business partner on the contractor filings. I folded my hands on the counter. I've known for 8 months, Sterling. I was waiting to understand the full shape of it. Something moved through Sterling's face. Not anger, not quite. More like a machine encountering something it wasn't designed for. The warmth drained slowly, the way a tide goes out, leaving behind the flat gray of what was underneath it. He started to say something. The bell above the door rang. Cora Hendricks walked into my shop carrying a folded navy umbrella and a small spiral notebook. She was dressed differently than the night before. A dark blazer, professional, a lanyard with a badge that she'd tucked inside, but which caught the light as she crossed the room. She came directly to the counter with the unhurried stride of someone who has been in difficult rooms before and has learned that the most reliable way to change the temperature of a room is simply to arrive in it with the right kind of presence. She set the umbrella on the counter. Beside it, she set the notebook. "Good morning, Mr. Briggs," she said. "I wanted to return these before the day got away from me." She looked at me, then she looked at Sterling. The recognition in her expression was precise and brief, the look of someone confirming what they expected to find. "Mr. Walcott," she said. Sterling's face went white, not pale white. Cora reached into her blazer and withdrew her badge, not a local shield, a federal one. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Office of Inspector General. She said her name and title with the clean economy of someone who has said them many times in rooms that needed to hear them. She turned back to me, and her voice changed, not softer but different, the difference between professional and personal. "I wasn't on Clement Avenue last night by accident," she said. "I've been building a case for 7 months. Shell companies filing predatory development offers against small business corridors across 3 estates, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana. The filings trace back to a limited partnership." She looked at Sterling once briefly. "Mr. Walcott's name is on the founding documents." Sterling said, "Those are legitimate real." "The contractor certifications are fraudulent," Cora said. "Flat final, the tone of something verified 11 different ways. We have the original filings. We have the transfer records. We have recorded phone conversations." She picked up the notebook then, Irene's notebook. She held it with both hands carefully, the same way she'd taken it the night before. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I need to tell you something about this." I had looked at the front of that notebook 100 times. Irene's customer entries, names and phone numbers and notes going back years. I had never looked at the back. Cora opened it to the back third. Irene's handwriting, smaller than usual, filling 8 or 9 pages in careful columns. Names, addresses, notes. Delmer family, Oak Street, approached twice by Westfield Group March and June, frightened. Referred to Carver Legal Aid. Sutton & Sons Plumbing, Clement Ave, received buyout offer, no disclosure of zoning change. Told to call me if anything else happened. Odom Property, Linden, 3rd notice this year. Percy knows an attorney, following up. Page after page after page. 2 years' worth, by the look of the dates. Irene had been collecting this quietly, the way she did everything she cared about, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission, by simply deciding it mattered and getting to work. She had never mentioned a word of it to me. "My mother's name is in there," Cora said, quiet, level, costing her something to keep it that way. "Greta Hendricks, Oak Street, page 4. I found the entry. Greta Hendricks, Oak Street, Unit 4, widowed, fixed income. Approached 3 times now. Very frightened. Helped her understand her rights under state statute. Good woman, keep checking in. My mother almost lost her apartment 3 years ago," Cora said. "Letters, calls, someone showing up at her door. She didn't understand what was happening. Then a woman from the hardware store on Clement Avenue started coming by on Saturdays, to explain, to sit with her." She paused. "My mother talked about her for 2 years. I grew up hearing about her. I knew her name." I had to set the notebook down. I pressed both hands flat on the counter and breathed through my nose. Irene had sat across from me at the kitchen table every Sunday morning for the last 2 years of her life, making coffee, asking about my week, watching whatever we watched on Saturday nights, and she had also been doing this, on her own time, because she'd seen something happening to the people around her, and she'd decided someone should do something about it. She hadn't told me, not because she was hiding it, because Irene never brought me a problem without at least the outline of a solution, and she'd still been working on the solution when the stroke took her. Percy came through the back door without knocking. He never knocked. It was his shop as much as mine, in the ways that mattered. He was carrying a file folder from the cabinet in the office. He set it on the counter without ceremony. The deed and the 8 months of correspondence with Morton, he said. He looked at Sterling with the expression of a man who has settled his opinion of another man and is at peace with it. I pulled it this morning, Mr. Briggs, in case it was needed. I had not asked Percy to do that. Percy had decided on his own. From the back of the shop came the sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs, the stairs that led up to the apartment above the store where Gladys Farmer had lived for 22 years. She was 78 years old and moved with the careful authority of a woman who had one hip replaced and was not going to let anything else slow her down. She came through the back door carrying a spiral notebook of her own and set it on the far end of the counter. "I've been listening from upstairs for the past 20 minutes, she said pleasantly. "I'd like to contribute." She opened to a page she'd marked with a sticky tab and read from it in the clear voice of a woman who spent 2 mornings a week reading to the vision impaired at the public library. "October 14th, she said. Man in dark coat, silver at the temples, standing outside Briggs Hardware on his phone. My window was open," he said. "The building's worth 4 times what the old man thinks. He doesn't know about the zoning change yet, and we need him not to know until the papers are signed. Leah will handle it. She always does." The shop went absolutely still. Leah made a sound, just a sound, small and involuntary, the sound of a person who has heard something they already half knew and had been hoping, in some quiet part of themselves, wasn't true. Sterling said, "Gladys, that's completely." "I am not speaking to you," Gladys said, with a pleasantness so complete it functioned as a wall. She closed her notebook. The back door opened, and Morton Graves came in with his leather portfolio and a coffee from the cart on the corner. He was my age, 67, and he moved through difficult rooms the way he'd been moving through them for 40 years, with the quiet certainty of a man who has brought the right things and knows exactly where to put them. He set his coffee on the end of the counter, opened his portfolio, and began laying out documents. Thatcher looked at Morton, then he looked at his own briefcase. He set it on the floor and did not pick it up again. Sterling looked at Leah. 16 years I had watched Sterling look at my daughter that way, with the eyes of a man who has long since stopped distinguishing between managing a situation and managing a person. I had told myself, for most of those years, that it wasn't my place to say anything, that Leah was an adult, that I could be wrong about him. I had known I wasn't wrong. I had just not been ready to stop pretending. Sterling said, just her name quiet, carrying something underneath it that was not a request. She was looking at the notebook, Irene's handwriting, page after page in the back half, recording the names of people her mother had quietly decided were worth her time, including the mother of the federal investigator standing 6 feet away. She looked up. She looked at me. I let her see whatever was on my face, which I couldn't have described to you, the grief and the love and the 16 years and all the Saturday mornings and the last time I'd seen Irene and everything in between. All of it right there, no pretense. A father looking at his daughter across 12 feet of worn hardwood floor. Leah looked at Sterling. "Get out," she said. He blinked. "Get out of my father's store." Her voice didn't shake. It was the steadiest I'd heard from her in years. Sterling started to say her name. "Don't." She said it the way her mother used to say it, not loud, just final. The kind of word that shuts a door. Thatcher had already picked up his briefcase. The property assessor was at the front door. Sterling stood there one more moment with his jaw working and his hands to sides, and then he made the calculation that a man like Sterling always makes when there is no move left. He left. The bell above the door rang once, and his car started too quickly in the street outside, the way engines sound when the person behind the wheel is pressing the ignition before they've fully decided where they're going. Then it was quiet. Morton stayed until midday, organizing everything that needed organizing. Cora stayed longer, going through Irene's notebook page by page with a recorder running, each entry another name, another piece of a pattern that now had documentation to match it. Percy swept the floor and reorganized the pipe fittings I'd been meaning to get to for a week. Gladys went back upstairs after leaving her notebook with Morton, declining coffee and a ride anywhere with the serenity of a woman who has done exactly what she intended. Before Cora left, she stood by the door with the umbrella in her hand. "My mother wants to meet you," she said. "She's been wanting to for 3 years. She said she never got the chance to thank your wife properly." I thought about Irene on a Saturday morning, driving to Oak Street with coffee cake, sitting with a frightened woman she didn't owe anything to, explaining rights under state statute, because she'd looked them up on her own time, because she believed it mattered. "Tell her any Saturday works," I said. Cora nodded. She held up the umbrella. Should I? Keep it, I said. It suits you. She left. The shop was quiet. Percy was in the back. The refrigerator hummed. I picked up Irene's notebook and held it for a moment. Then I set it on the counter beside the register and looked at it and thought about all the things a person can do in the margins of an ordinary life without anyone knowing if they decide something is worth doing and they simply do it. At 8:17 that evening, the front door opened without the bell. Someone who'd turned the handle slowly, like they weren't certain they had the right. Leah came in. She was still in the gray coat, but her hair had come loose, and she had the look of someone who had spent the intervening hours sitting alone with something too large to process quickly. She stopped just inside the door and looked around the shop the way she'd stopped doing when she was about 14, actually looking at the shelves and the displays and the old brass register her mother had found and refused to give up. I drove around for 2 hours, she said. I kept ending up back on Clement. Roads do that sometimes, I said. She crossed to the counter and sat on the stool by the register, not the one Sterling had used, the old one, the one she'd always sat on as a little girl. Dad, she said, I'm sorry. I let that sit for a moment before I answered, not to make her wait, just because it deserved more than a quick response. I know, I said, and I need you to know I'm not angry. I'm heartbroken. Those are different things. I need you to understand I know the difference. Her hands were folded on the counter and trembling slightly. I went to the back room and opened the small refrigerator. Irene had kept glass bottle Cokes in there since Leah was 9 years old and would come by on summer days after school. She'd kept them in there long after Leah was grown, because it was one of those small habits that accumulates meaning. Without you deciding to give it meaning, it just becomes part of what a place is. I brought 2 bottles back and set one in front of my daughter. She looked at it for a long time, then she pressed her hand over her mouth. Then she was crying, not the careful tears from this morning, but the real kind. The kind that happens when you've held something so long your body finally does what your mind has been refusing to do for too long. I didn't fill the silence. Irene had spent 43 years teaching me that some moments don't need words, they need you to stay. After a while, Leah looked up. Mom knew, didn't she? She said, not a question. I think she knew a lot of things, I said. She was always the one paying attention. I didn't know the whole shape of it, Leah said. About the money, about what he was planning. I want you to know that. I believe you, I said. And I did. I believed the part of her that had been caught inside something without fully understanding the architecture of it. I also believed she'd stopped asking herself certain questions because she'd been afraid of the answers, and those were not the same thing, and we were going to have to talk about that eventually. But not tonight. I kept telling myself it was fine, she said, that he was ambitious, that I should trust his judgment. She looked at the counter between us. He used to say you were out of touch, that you didn't understand how things worked anymore. And somewhere along the way, I started taking his version of things without checking it against my own. I thought about 16 years, about all the moments I'd watched him redirect her, finish her sentences in directions she hadn't chosen, manage friction before she could decide for herself whether it mattered. Your mother never took anyone's version of anything, I said. Not mine, not anyone else's. It used to drive me absolutely crazy. I looked at the notebook on the counter. Now I understand it was the best thing about her. Leah was quiet. What do I do now? She said. You figure out what you think, I said, without anyone else deciding for you. You haven't done that in a while. It'll feel strange at first. She picked up the Coke bottle, turned it in her hands, the way she'd done when she was small. Morton will want to talk to you, I said. You don't have to decide anything tonight. Okay, she said. We stayed past closing. The refrigerator hummed. The streetlights on Clement Avenue came on in the amber way they do in March, throwing long lines through the window and across the floor. Leah asked me about the notebook, what Irene had been doing, how long, who she'd helped. I told her what I knew, and I told her what I intended to find out, which was everything. I planned to contact every name in those pages. I planned to find out which ones still needed help and make sure they got it. It was the least I could do with what Irene had started. Leah listened the way her mother used to listen, completely, without filling the space. At some point she said she left this for both of us. She did, I said. Leah set down the bottle. She looked at me with Irene's eyes, the same angle of the chin, the same absolute refusal to look away from something that matters. I'm going to do better, she said. I know, I said. You always could. You just needed to remember it was possible. She stayed until nearly 10. When she left, she hugged me at the door the way she had when she was 7 years old and had spent a whole Saturday at the shop asking questions about how everything worked. Not the brief, careful hug of someone maintaining a shape, the real kind. I locked up and stood alone in the quiet. On the counter near the register sat Irene's notebook. I picked it up, opened it to the first page, where her handwriting went back 22 years. Names, numbers, small careful notes about the people who had counted on us. I read from the beginning, every name, every entry, every small record of everyone my wife had decided deserved her attention. It took me a long time. Every minute of it was worth it.